So the wisdom we find in the Scriptures is counterintuitive. It runs against the cultural norms that we're taught. However, that's what we find a lot with the Bible throughout. And so this whole idea of heaping up coals on their heads is got to be related to the shame or the embarrassment or the sense of remorse that one who does evil experiences when the evil is not responded in kind. So, you know, the typical scenario is you go to push somebody and then they push you back just as hard, maybe a little harder. And then you're like, well, you push me back even harder, so I punch you. So then you kick me. So then I take out a knife. So you take out a gun. So you take out a bomb. You know, and it's just this escalatory nature of violence. And so when evil doesn't get met with the same retaliatory kind of evil that it's putting out, it has no place to go other than to be like burning coals on someone's head. And then it gives people an opportunity, because the sort of nonviolent love Jesus talks about and is being spoken of here by Paul is an opportunity for the person doing evil to be confronted in a way that has their interests at heart, which is what love is. And that gives them an opportunity to consider what they're doing and to say, wow, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I shouldn't do this. So then when we get into chapter 13, this is the same book of the Bible. So I don't think we can use chapter 13 to make the point, oh, well, Christians should be in the government and, you know, in your heart, love your enemy. But if called upon to flip the switch on the electrical chair, then you kill the guy, because that's what the state requires. And so when I put my state hat on, then I act in that role. But in my heart, I really am expressing love towards this. Let me just clarify something right now. If you kill me, it's not loving. If you cut off one of my legs, that's not loving. If you punched me in the head, that's not loving. Simple as that. And I think any child can understand that killing people is not loving to them. So what we have here in chapter 13 is the role of the government. The role of the government is God's servant to execute wrath. Now, the Apostle Paul has already said that we are to leave room for the wrath of God. So this is one way in which God's wrath is exercised in the here and now, is through human governments. And that's why as Christians we're not to resist the authority of God that's given to the government to do this job. We're not called upon to participate in the government, but we are to recognize the role that God has given the government. And when these things get confused, Romans 12 and Romans 13 get blended together, and you can't make any sense out of it, because Romans 12 very clearly tells us Christians that we are not to take revenge, that we are not to repay evil with evil. And yet that's exactly what the job of the government is. God says that the government is given a sword to execute justice on the evildoers, and that's the wrath of God. And so you can't do both at the same time. And so Christians, our role is very clearly outlined in Romans 12, and then the government's role is clearly outlined in Romans 13, but then our responsibility, our position towards the government is to pay taxes, to give honor to whom honor is due, revenue to whose revenue is due, and recognize that the government is necessary. We're not anarchists. We're not trying to destroy the government. We're trying to follow God and recognize that God has given the government a certain role. In Romans 13, the government is given a role by God. And it says that we, as Christians, actually it says every person in Romans 13:1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And this sort of insistence on obeying the government. I have a couple things to say about that. First is, that's not a blanket statement no matter what, because we do have clear examples where government disobedience is required. So, for example, in the Old Testament, when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah refused to bow to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, that was the right thing to do, even though the government was saying, you must bow before this statue and worship this idol. Another example that comes to mind is when the apostles were told no longer to speak in the name of Christ, and they flat out disobeyed the government right to its face and said, look, whether it's right inside of you or God or men, we can't do other than what we've seen, and we have to obey God rather than people. So there is precedent to disobey the government when the government asks you to do something that God says we shouldn't do. That is clear. However, with that obvious exception, the governments that are in place are, according to this, ordained by God to do a certain job. And what's so fascinating here is that the government in question when the Apostle Paul is writing Romans 13 is the Roman government, and the emperor in charge is Nero. Not only that, but the Apostle Peter says very similar things to what is said here, and he also was writing during the time of Nero, more than likely. So Nero was an anti-Christian who punished Christians because of the fire in Rome. Now, Christians were not the ones who caused the fire in Rome. There's some historical debate over whether Nero had anything to do with it or not. The legend is Nero fiddled as Rome burned. Of course, fiddles weren't invented yet, and Nero wasn't in the city either, so that doesn't really work. But the point is, our people were singled out as the ones who were to blame, and Nero persecuted us severely. He used Christians as torches to light up his garden. He sewed us into animal skins in front of the public for recreational purposes, for entertainment. He's just a vicious person, and he was not liked by the Senate. You know, he was not liked by his own people. He was a bad ruler, and yet that's who was in charge when these words were written. So I don't think the excuse of, oh, well, our government's worse than this government is going to fly. I think it's our job to submit to the government so far as, you know, it is possible, and then if the government makes laws that are against what God says, then it's our duty to disobey those laws and take the consequences for that. So it's important to keep that historical context in mind so that we understand it's not all just a wonderful time when he wrote these words. It was really bad. And in fact, Paul and Peter both more than likely met their death under Nero.